On the first morning at the $74 million lakefront estate, Grant Holloway had not even finished unpacking his boxes when a line of SUVs bearing the Homeowners Association logo pulled up outside the gate. At the front of the group walked Vanessa Whitmore, the association president known throughout the community for forcing every homeowner to bow to her authority. Without asking to see a single document, Vanessa marched straight onto the property, pointed her finger at Grant, and announced that he had 30 minutes to leave the premises, because in her words, this neighborhood was not meant for people like him. Less than 1 hour later, sheriff's deputies were the ones escorting Vanessa off the land in handcuffs while the entire community stood frozen in disbelief. If stories like this one where arrogance meets consequence are the kind you enjoy, stay until the very end, because what happens next will surprise even the most skeptical viewer. The town of Cedar Hollow sat along the edge of a long, glassy lake ringed by pine trees and old money. For decades, the lakefront strip had belonged to a handful of families who never bothered to introduce themselves to anyone, and the estate at the far end of Lakeshore Drive was the crown jewel of the entire region. It came with a private marina, a weathered boathouse, a helicopter pad tucked behind a stand of red oaks, acres of untouched forest, and a stretch of private shoreline road that no map outside the county recorder's office even showed. For nearly 40 years, the property had passed quietly between trustees and estates, rarely seen, rarely discussed, and never not once sold to an outsider. That changed on a gray Tuesday morning when a plain white pickup truck rolled slowly through the open iron gates. Behind the wheel sat a man named Grant Holloway, 46 years old, wearing a faded flannel shirt and work boots that had clearly seen better days. He carried no entourage, no moving crew, no black SUV trailing behind him. He simply parked near the boathouse, stepped out, stretched his back, and looked out at the lake, as though he had been waiting his whole life to see it. Grant did not look like a man who had just closed on one of the largest private purchases in the county's history. He looked like someone who fixed his own fence posts and changed his own oil, and that was precisely the problem, because within an hour, half of Lakeshore Drive had already decided who he must be. Some neighbors whispered that he was the new groundskeeper. Others assumed he managed the property for a family that preferred to stay anonymous. Nobody, not for a second, considered that the man in the flannel shirt held the deed in his own name. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had grown used to operating under an entirely different kind of ownership, one that had nothing to do with legal paperwork and everything to do with fear. For nearly a decade, the Homeowners Association at Cedar Hollow had been run by Vanessa Whitmore, a woman who treated her elected position as though it came with a crown. She decided which paint colors were acceptable and which were an affront to the community. She decided whose mailbox needed replacing and whose lawn ornaments had to go. And somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that her authority extended past the boundary lines of the association and onto every inch of shoreline in Cedar Hollow, including the private estate she had never once been invited to, into. When Vanessa spotted the unfamiliar truck through her kitchen window that morning, she did not see a new neighbor. She saw a problem, an intrusion, a man who had somehow slipped past her without her permission or her blessing. And Vanessa Whitmore did not tolerate problems. She picked up her phone, called 2 board members, gathered her assistant, and set out toward the gates of the estate with the calm, terrifying confidence of a woman who had never once been told no and fully expected that streak to continue. By the time Vanessa's convoy reached the property, Grant had barely carried 3 boxes inside. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel before he saw the vehicles, 4 of them in total doors, opening almost in unison as though rehearsed. Vanessa stepped out first, dressed in a crisp blazer, despite the early hour, flanked by 2 board members named Harold Briggs and Diane Foster, along with her assistant, a young woman named Linda, who carried a clipboard she never once looked at. Vanessa did not wait for an invitation. She pushed through the gate that Grant had left open for the movers, walked directly onto the gravel drive, and stood at the base of the front steps, as though she owned the ground beneath her heels. She looked Grant up and down, taking in the flannel shirt, the work boots, the plain truck parked near the boathouse, and something in her expression hardened into contempt before she had even said a word. "You have 30 minutes to remove yourself from this property," Vanessa announced, her voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority. "The Homeowners Association governs this entire stretch of shoreline, and frankly, this neighborhood is not the right fit for someone in your position." Grant set down the box he was holding, wiped his hands on his jeans, and studied the woman standing on land she had not been invited onto. He did not raise his voice. He did not step back. He simply asked evenly whether she had a court order authorizing her presence on the property. Vanessa laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the water behind them, and told him that around here she was the law. Grant's expression did not change. He repeated his request, this time more plainly, asking her to leave the private property she was currently standing on. Vanessa refused, insisting that the association had jurisdiction over every home along the lake, that new arrivals were required to be vetted, and that a man dressed the way Grant was dressed had no business owning a home of this caliber. Harold and Diane nodded along beside her, and Linda scribbled something on her clipboard that nobody would ever actually read. What none of them realized, standing there in their tailored blazers and polished shoes, was that the man they were trying to intimidate had spent the better part of 2 decades building companies from nothing, negotiating with people far more dangerous than a homeowners association president, and learning exactly how to stay calm while everyone around him lost their composure. Grant simply folded his arms, looked out at the lake for a moment, and told Vanessa that she was welcome to leave the way she came because he had no intention of going anywhere. Vanessa's face flushed red. She had expected tears, panic, maybe an apology, and a hurried exit toward the truck. Instead, she was met with a stillness that unsettled her more than any argument could have. She turned to Linda and told her to call the sheriff's department immediately, insisting that a trespasser had taken over one of the most valuable properties in the county and needed to be removed before he caused any real damage. The call went out within minutes, and Vanessa reported the situation as though she were preventing a crime in progress. She told the dispatcher that an unknown man had broken into a private estate, that he refused to leave when confronted by association leadership, and that immediate law enforcement response was required. She said all of this with total conviction. The same conviction she had used for years, to bully neighbors into repainting their shutters, or removing basketball hoops from their driveways. Grant, for his part, did nothing dramatic. He did not argue with Vanessa further, or try to explain himself to the small crowd that had begun gathering near the fence line, drawn by the flashing lights of Vanessa's own vehicle and the sound of raised voices carrying across the portiolet. Water. He simply walked calmly into the house, retrieved a leather folder from the front seat of his truck, and returned to the porch to wait, the same unreadable expression on his face the entire time. Inside that folder sat everything anyone could possibly need to confirm exactly who owned the estate. There was the finalized purchase agreement signed and notarized weeks earlier. There was the deed itself, freshly recorded with the county. There was a full title report from the closing attorney, along with a certified land survey outlining every acre, every boundary line, and every easement attached to the property. Grant had learned long ago that in disputes like this one, paper mattered more than volume, and he intended to let the paper speak for itself. Vanessa, meanwhile, grew more agitated with each passing minute, pacing near the gate and glancing repeatedly toward the road, certain that the arrival of deputies would finally validate everything she had said. She turned to Harold and Diane and told them this was exactly the kind of situation the association existed to prevent unqualified individuals slipping through the cracks and lowering the standards of the entire neighborhood. Neither board member said much in response, though Diane, notably, had stopped nodding along quite so eagerly. When the patrol vehicles finally arrived, 2 deputies stepped out, a tall man named Deputy Mark Reynolds and his partner, Deputy Sarah Collins. Vanessa practically ran toward them before their doors had fully closed already, speaking before they could ask a single question. She explained breathlessly that a man had illegally occupied one of the most valuable homes on the lake, that he had refused every request to leave, and that as association president, she expected him removed from the property immediately. Deputy Reynolds held up a hand and asked her to slow down, requesting to hear directly from the property owner before drawing any conclusions. Vanessa bristled at the suggestion that there was anything left to clarify, insisting that the facts were already obvious. Still, the deputies walked past her toward the porch where Grant stood waiting, folder in hand, entirely unbothered by the flashing lights or the small crowd now pressed against the fence. Grant introduced himself calmly, extended the folder, and explained that he had purchased the property several weeks earlier through a private sale that had closed without any complications. He handed over the deed first, followed by the notarized purchase agreement, and finally the certified survey showing the full boundaries of the land. Deputy Collins examined each document carefully, while her partner glanced repeatedly between the paperwork and Vanessa, whose confident expression had begun to falter for the first time all morning. Every document checked out. The names matched, the recording stamps were current, and the property description aligned precisely with the estate they were standing on. Deputy Reynolds looked up from the folder and asked Vanessa a simple question, one she had clearly never been asked before in all her years of walking onto other people's land without permission. He asked her how exactly she had entered the property that morning. Vanessa straightened her blazer and answered without hesitation, telling the deputy that as president of the Homeowners Association, she had every right to inspect properties within her jurisdiction. Deputy Reynolds asked more pointedly this time whether she had received written consent from the owner or any form of legal authorization to enter. Vanessa paused for the first time, then repeated the same phrase she had used earlier that morning, the one that had worked on every homeowner in Cedar Hollow for nearly a decade. She told him flatly that she had authority. The words landed differently, coming from a woman standing in front of 2 deputies who had just examined a legitimate deed. Deputy Collins exchanged a glance with her partner, the kind of look that suggested this situation had just shifted entirely, and asked Vanessa to step back from the porch while they continued their assessment. For the first time that morning, Vanessa found herself being asked to move rather than issuing the order herself. As the small crowd along the fence line continued to grow, murmurs began rippling through the group of onlookers, most of whom had assumed, just like Vanessa, that the flannel-shirted stranger would be the one leaving in handcuffs. Instead, Deputy Reynolds asked whether the estate had any security cameras installed, and Grant nodded, mentioning that the prior owners had left a full surveillance system connected to a cloud server, one he had gained access to during closing, and had already reviewed briefly that same morning. Grant retrieved a tablet from inside the house and pulled up the footage from the front gate camera, time-stamped from less than 2 hours earlier. The video showed in clear and undeniable detail Vanessa pushing through the gate without waiting for permission, walking briskly across the gravel drive, and positioning herself at the base of the porch steps before Grant had even finished carrying his second box inside. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Only a woman entering private property uninvited, and immediately issuing threats to the man who legally owned it. Deputy Collins reviewed the footage twice, then turned to Vanessa and asked whether she disputed what the camera had recorded. Vanessa, visibly rattled, now insisted that the footage did not capture the full context, that her intentions had been misunderstood, and that she had simply been attempting to protect the character of the neighborhood. But the footage spoke plainly, showing threats issued and eviction demanded, and an outsider who never once raised his voice in response. More neighbors had gathered by then, drawn by the flashing lights and the sight of Vanessa's own SUV parked crookedly near the gate. Among them stood a longtime resident named Carol Jennings, who had lived on Lakeshore Drive for nearly 15 years, and had crossed paths with Vanessa more times than she cared to count. Carol watched the scene unfold with an expression that shifted slowly from curiosity to quiet vindication, as though she had been waiting years for a morning exactly like this one. Deputy Reynolds turned back to Vanessa and asked her directly whether she had any legal document granting the association authority over this particular parcel of land. Vanessa hesitated, then began citing the association's bylaws, insisting that the covenant governing Cedar Hollow extended to every property along the shoreline, including this one. Grant, still calm, reached back into his folder and produced the certified land survey, laying it flat on the porch railing for everyone to see. The survey told a story Vanessa had spent years hoping nobody would ever bother to check. The boundary lines showed clearly that the estate sat entirely outside the jurisdiction of the homeowners association, separated by a narrow strip of county-owned land that had been established decades earlier as a buffer between the private lakefront parcels and the newer development further inland. The property merely bordered the association's territory. It had never, not for a single day, actually belonged to it. Deputy Collins studied the survey lines carefully, then asked Vanessa how long the association had been claiming authority over properties along this particular stretch of shoreline. Vanessa's answer came slower this time, less certain, as she mumbled something about long-standing practice and community expectations. But the deputies were no longer interested in expectations. They were interested in documents, and the documents told a very different story than the one Vanessa had been telling for years. Word began spreading through the small crowd near the fence, neighbors turning to whisper to one another as the truth settled over the gathering. Several of them exchanged uneasy glances, recalling fines they had paid for violations. Vanessa had invented letters. They had received threatening liens against their homes, and mandatory fees. They had never fully understood the purpose of. The realization crept across the group slowly, that the woman who had run their neighborhood with an iron grip for nearly a decade might never have possessed the authority she claimed in the first place. Deputy Reynolds asked Vanessa to step away from the property entirely while the department completed its verification of ownership. Vanessa refused, insisting that she had every right to remain, that this was still in her mind association business regardless of what the survey showed. She raised her voice, cutting off Deputy Collins mid-sentence, demanding that Grant be the one removed rather than herself. The deputies exchanged another glance, and this time it carried a note of finality. Deputy Reynolds informed Vanessa calmly but firmly that she was currently standing on private property without the consent of the legal owner, and that continued refusal to leave would be treated as trespassing. Vanessa laughed again, though the sound carried far less confidence than it had an hour earlier, and told the deputies that they clearly did not understand how things worked in Cedar Hollow. Harold Briggs, standing off to the side, had gone noticeably quiet, his earlier nodding replaced by a kind of stiff, uncomfortable silence. Diane Foster had taken several steps back from Vanessa, entirely positioning herself closer to the fence line, as though physically distancing herself from whatever was about to happen next. Even Linda, the assistant with the untouched clipboard, seemed to be reconsidering her career choices in real time. Deputy Reynolds gave Vanessa one final warning, explaining plainly that she needed to leave the property immediately or face arrest for trespassing on private land. Vanessa stood her ground, arms crossed, insisting once more that her position as association president gave her standing that superseded ordinary property law. She seemed genuinely convinced even in that moment that her title alone would be enough to make the deputies back down the way every homeowner in Cedar Hollow always had. It was not enough. Deputy Collins stepped forward and informed Vanessa that she was being placed under arrest for trespassing, given her repeated refusal to leave, despite clear and lawful direction. The words seemed to hang in the morning air for a long moment before Vanessa fully processed them, her expression shifting from indignation to genuine shock as Deputy Reynolds reached for his handcuffs. The crowd along the fence fell completely silent. Nobody had expected this outcome, least of all Vanessa herself, who continued protesting even as the cuffs clicked into place around her wrists. She insisted over and over that there had been some enormous mistake, that the deputies would regret this once they understood who she really was in this community. But her words carried none of the weight they once had drowned out by the quiet, stunned murmurs rippling through the crowd behind her. Deputy Reynolds walked Vanessa toward the patrol car, slowly giving her every opportunity along the way to remain quiet and preserve whatever dignity she had left. But she refused that opportunity at every step. She turned back toward the crowd near the fence and shouted that this community would regret what had just happened, that property values would collapse without her guidance, and that every person watching would come crawling back to her within a year begging for the old rules to be restored. Nobody in the crowd answered her. A few neighbors simply looked away uncomfortable, while others exchanged glances that suggested the opposite outcome seemed far more likely. Linda, the assistant who had trailed behind Vanessa all morning with an untouched clipboard, quietly set the clipboard down on the porch railing and walked toward her own car without a word to anyone. She would later tell a friend that she had taken the assistant position 2 years earlier because Vanessa had promised her a future role on the board, a promise that in hindsight had always felt more like a leash than an opportunity. She did not return to any association function after that morning. Grant said nothing as Vanessa was led past him toward the patrol vehicle. He did not gloat, did not smirk, did not offer so much as a passing glance in her direction. He simply stood on the porch of the home he had legally purchased, folder still in hand, and watched as the woman who had tried to remove him from his own property was escorted off of it instead, exactly 1 hour after she had first arrived. News of what happened at the lakefront estate spread through Cedar Hollow faster than anyone could have anticipated. By that evening, small clusters of neighbors had gathered on porches and driveways, trading versions of the story that grew slightly more dramatic with each retelling, though the core facts remained unmistakably true. The woman who had run the homeowners association like a personal fiefdom for nearly a decade had been arrested on the very property she had tried to seize control of. Carol Jennings, still shaken from what she had witnessed that morning, found herself sitting at her kitchen table that night, composing an email she had wanted to send for years but never quite found the courage to write. She detailed a fine she had received 3 years earlier for a mailbox post that did not match association specifications, despite the fact that no such specifications had ever been distributed in writing. She sent the email not to the association itself, but directly to Grant Holloway, whose contact information had quickly circulated among neighbors eager to share their own stories. Within days, Grant's inbox had filled with dozens of similar messages. One neighbor forwarded a threatening letter demanding immediate payment of a fine for holiday decorations left up 2 days past an arbitrary deadline. Another shared records of a lien placed against their home over an unpaid assessment that had in fact been paid in full with a receipt attached as proof. A third resident described being forced to sign a document waiving certain rights before being allowed to install solar panels, a document that upon closer inspection appeared to have no legal standing whatsoever. Grant read through each message, carefully recognizing patterns that extended far beyond a single overzealous personality. This was not simply the story of one woman abusing a modest amount of authority. This looked increasingly like a structural problem that had been allowed to fester for years because nobody had ever pushed back hard enough to expose it. He decided after several days of quiet reflection near the boathouse that walking away from the situation was no longer an option. He reached out to a real estate and association law firm, 2 counties over, connecting with an attorney named Robert Ainsley, who had spent the better part of 20 years untangling disputes between homeowners and the boards meant to serve them. Robert listened to Grant's account of the morning at the estate, then reviewed the growing folder of resident complaints, and told Grant plainly that what he was describing sounded less like isolated misconduct and more like a pattern of governance failure spanning years. Robert assembled a small team to begin a formal review of the association's records, requesting financial statements, meeting minutes, fee schedules, and correspondence dating back nearly 8 years. The association's own bylaws required these records to be made available to residents upon request, though, in practice, few homeowners had ever successfully obtained them without facing pushback or delay. With legal representation behind the request, the association had no real grounds left to refuse. What the review uncovered painted a troubling picture. Assessment fees had increased steadily over the years without corresponding votes from the general membership votes that were supposedly required under the association's own governing documents. Several large expenditures, including a lakeside gazebo that residents barely remembered approving, appeared to have been authorized solely by Vanessa herself, bypassing the board entirely on more than one occasion. Meeting minutes from several contentious sessions had simply vanished from the official record. Perhaps most damning were the waiver documents. Several residents had described agreements drafted under the association's letterhead that asked homeowners to relinquish certain rights in exchange for approval of routine home improvements. Robert's team confirmed quickly that these documents held no legal weight whatsoever, meaning residents had been pressured for years into signing away rights they never actually needed to give up in order to install a fence, repaint a shutter, or add a small addition to their homes. As the investigation deepened, Harold Briggs reached out to Grant directly requesting a private conversation away from the rest of the board. Over coffee at a small diner near the edge of town, Harold admitted somewhat reluctantly that he had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Vanessa's leadership over the past several years, but had never felt he had the standing or the evidence to challenge her openly. He offered to provide a written statement corroborating several of the financial irregularities the legal team had already uncovered. Diane Foster followed a similar path, only days later sending Robert's office a lengthy email detailing instances where she had raised concerns internally, only to be dismissed or quietly excluded from future decisions. She described a culture within the board where disagreement was treated as disloyalty, and where Vanessa had cultivated an atmosphere in which very few people felt safe pushing back against her decisions, no matter how questionable they seemed. With Vanessa still facing the pending trespassing charge and now confronted with a growing body of evidence regarding financial mismanagement, her grip on the association began to loosen with startling speed. Residents who had spent years quietly resenting her leadership suddenly found themselves emboldened, no longer afraid that speaking up would result in a retaliatory fine or a hostile letter demanding compliance with some invented rule. A special meeting was called the first in the association's recent history, where attendance filled every available seat in the community clubhouse and spilled out into the parking lot beyond. Grant did not attend to seek revenge, and he made that clear from the outset, choosing instead to let the documentation speak entirely for itself. He submitted a written summary of the legal team's findings to the board ahead of time, along with copies of the resident complaints, financial discrepancies, and the surveillance footage from the morning of the confrontation. The meeting began with Vanessa attempting to regain control of the room the way she always had, standing at the front and addressing the crowd as though nothing unusual had occurred. She insisted that recent events had been blown wildly out of proportion, that her leadership had kept property values high and standards consistent, and that the association owed her a debt of gratitude rather than scrutiny. For years, this kind of speech had been enough to silence dissent in the room. This time it was not enough. Carol Jennings stood first, reading aloud the email she had sent detailing the mailbox fine issued without any published standard to justify it. Another resident followed, describing the improperly authorized lien against their property. A third read from the waiver document they had been pressured to sign years earlier, now confirmed by legal counsel to hold no actual authority. One by one, residents who had stayed silent for years finally spoke, and the collective weight of their accounts began to bury Vanessa's protests entirely. Harold Briggs, seated near the front of the room, eventually stood and addressed the crowd, directly confirming publicly what he had already told Grant privately, that financial decisions had been made without proper board approval on multiple occasions. Diane Foster followed shortly after, offering her own account of being sidelined whenever she raised concerns. Their combined testimony, coming from Vanessa's own longtime allies, carried a weight that no amount of deflection could overcome. By the end of the meeting, both Harold and Diane submitted their formal resignations from the board, stating that they could no longer serve under a system that had operated with so little transparency for so long. A vote was called for Vanessa's removal from the presidency, and it passed with an overwhelming majority, residents raising their hands almost in unison, many of them for the very first time daring to openly oppose a woman they had quietly feared for years. Vanessa left the meeting that night without the title she had clung to for nearly a decade, her authority stripped away, not through revenge or spectacle, but through the slow, methodical accumulation of documented truth. The trespassing charge from the morning at the estate remained pending in the county court system, a separate matter entirely from her removal, but one that would only add further weight to the collapse of the reputation she had spent years constructing. In the weeks that followed, the newly reorganized board, now led by residents with no history of abusing their position, worked alongside Robert Ainsley's team to overhaul the association's governing documents entirely. Fee structures were rewritten with full transparency and required member approval for any significant increase. Financial statements would now be published quarterly for every resident to review. A formal appeals process was established for any fine or violation notice, ensuring no single individual could ever again wield unilateral power over their neighbors' homes. Grant, throughout this entire process, remained largely in the background, offering documentation when requested, but never inserting himself into decisions that belonged rightfully to the residents themselves. He had not purchased the lakefront estate to become embroiled in neighborhood politics, and he made a point of stepping back once the truth had been laid plainly on the table for everyone to see. His role had never been to punish Vanessa personally. It had simply been to refuse, calmly and completely, to be pushed off land that was legally his. The new board's first order of business involved a full independent audit of every fine issued over the previous 5 years, a task that took the better part of 2 months to complete. Robert Ainsley's office coordinated with an outside accounting firm to cross-reference every violation notice against the association's actual published rules, and the results confirmed what many residents had already suspected in private for years. Nearly a third of all fines issued during that period had no valid rule attached to them whatsoever, invented on the spot to justify whatever grievance Vanessa happened to be nursing that week. The board voted unanimously to refund every improperly issued fine, a decision that ultimately returned tens of thousands of dollars to residents who had quietly paid penalties they never should have owed in the first place. Carol Jennings received a refund for the mailbox, fine she had complained about years earlier, along with a formal written apology from the association, acknowledging that no standard for mailbox posts had ever actually existed. She framed the apology letter and hung it in her hallway, less out of pride than as a quiet reminder of how easily unchecked authority could take root if nobody bothered to question it. Other residents came forward with stories that had never made it into the initial wave of complaints, describing years of selective enforcement where certain homeowners faced constant scrutiny, while others, usually those closest to Vanessa, personally were allowed to violate the very same rules, without consequence. One family described watching their neighbor receive a warning for a fence height violation, while another home down the street, belonging to one of Vanessa's closest friends, kept an identical fence for years without a single letter ever being sent. The new board members, determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past, instituted a rotating oversight committee made up of ordinary residents rather than a small, entrenched leadership group. Meetings were now recorded and made available to anyone who could not attend in person. Decisions involving expenditures above a modest threshold required a full resident vote rather than unilateral board approval, closing the exact loophole that had allowed the lakeside gazebo and several other questionable projects to move forward without anyone's real consent. As spring arrived along Lakeshore Drive, Grant turned his attention back to the estate itself, beginning a careful renovation that respected the property's long history while restoring parts of it that had fallen into disrepair over the decades. He hired local contractors rather than outside firms, choosing to funnel the investment directly back into the community that surrounded him. Slowly, the estate began to feel less like a mysterious fortress at the end of the road, and more like an actual part of the neighborhood. Grant opened sections of the private marina for limited community use, coordinating with the newly reformed association to establish clear guidelines for shared access during summer months. He contributed funding toward a lake conservation initiative that had been struggling for donors for years, helping to restore a stretch of shoreline that had suffered from years of erosion and neglect. He also established a modest scholarship fund for local students pursuing environmental science, quietly funding it without ever attaching his name publicly to the announcement. The old boathouse, which had sat neglected for the better part of 2 decades, was restored plank by plank using reclaimed cedar that matched the original construction as closely as possible. Grant insisted on hiring a small crew from a nearby town rather than a large outside contractor. And over the course of the project, several of the workers became familiar faces around the property, often staying late into the evening to share a meal with Grant on the porch once the day's work was done. What had once been a symbol of exclusion, a gate nobody outside the family had ever been allowed past, slowly became a place where local kids were permitted to fish off the end of the dock on weekend afternoons, provided they asked politely first. Word of the estate's transformation reached beyond Cedar Hollow, and a small regional newspaper eventually ran a short feature on the conservation partnership Grant had funded along the shoreline. He declined to be interviewed for the piece, asking instead that the article focus entirely on the environmental work itself, rather than on him personally. The reporter honored the request, and the resulting story mentioned Grant only briefly, in a single sentence describing him as a private landowner who preferred to let his actions speak for themselves. Residents who once assumed Grant was merely a caretaker or property manager gradually came to understand the truth, not through any grand announcement but through the steady, unassuming way he moved through the community. He waved to neighbors on his morning walks along the shoreline road. He helped push a stranded boat off the rocks near the public dock one afternoon without a second thought. He never once mentioned the fortune behind the flannel shirts he continued to wear, and somehow, That quiet consistency earned him more respect than any display of wealth ever could have. Carol Jennings, reflecting on the entire ordeal months later while tending her garden near the fence line, remarked to a neighbor that the whole community had spent years assuming power looked a certain way: loud, demanding, dressed in tailored blazers, and backed by threats. What nobody had expected was that real strength could look like a man in work boots, standing perfectly still, simply refusing to move. By early autumn, the pending trespassing case against Vanessa had quietly worked its way through the county court system, resulting in a conviction that carried a modest fine and a period of probation, a far smaller consequence than the loss of her reputation and standing within the very community she had once controlled so completely. She sold her home along Lakeshore Drive not long after choosing to relocate somewhere she was not recognized on sight by every resident she passed. Grant, for his part, never spoke publicly about the confrontation that had defined his first morning at the estate. When neighbors occasionally brought it up at community gatherings, he offered only a brief, measured response, explaining that he had simply refused to let anyone convince him he did not belong on land he had lawfully purchased. He never framed it as a victory over Vanessa personally. He framed it always as a matter of principle, one that extended far beyond himself to every resident who had ever felt powerless against an authority that was never truly there. Winter came slowly to the lake that year, dusting the pines along the shoreline and turning the surface of the water a pale, quiet gray. Grant spent much of the season indoors reviewing plans for a small community boathouse workshop where local teenagers could learn basic woodworking and boat maintenance under the supervision of the same crew that had restored the estate's own boathouse months earlier. It was a modest project by the standards of a $74 million property, costing a fraction of what a single gala at the old association clubhouse might have run, and yet it did more to earn Grant the trust of Cedar Hollow than any grand gesture ever could have. Carol Jennings often walked past the estate on her afternoon strolls, sometimes stopping to chat with Grant if she caught him working near the fence line. She told him once without much ceremony that the neighborhood finally felt like a place people wanted to live in rather than a place they were simply enduring. Grant thanked her for saying so, then returned to whatever task had occupied his hands that afternoon, never one to linger long on praise. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the water and painted the surface of the lake in shades of amber and gold, Grant walked out to the end of the private dock alone, the same dock where deputies had once stood examining documents that would ultimately unravel years of quiet abuse. The SUVs that had once patrolled the neighborhood with such menace were long gone. There were no more arbitrary fines taped to mailboxes, no more threatening letters demanding compliance with rules that existed only in one woman's imagination. Standing there in the fading light, Grant thought about how easily the entire situation could have gone differently had he been the kind of man who panicked under pressure or folded at the first sign of confrontation. But he had learned long before that morning that true authority rarely needed to raise its voice, that it simply needed to stand firm and let the truth do the rest of the work. The lake stretched out quiet and still before him, exactly the way it should have been from the very beginning, undisturbed by anyone who mistook a title for real power. Never confuse a job title with actual authority, because the people who hold genuine power rarely need to shout about it, and the law will always stand behind the truth, no matter how loudly someone else tries to drown it out. 3 days after his uncle's funeral, Nathan Cole received a letter that would change the entire course of his life. Inside was a certificate of inheritance for 1,100 acres of land, signed and sealed by a county court. He assumed he had just become the owner of some quiet, overgrown farmland somewhere out past the highway. He had no idea that on that land stood an entire gated community, one that had spent years pretending it belonged to no one else but themselves. When he finally drove through the front gate to see his inheritance for the first time, a woman in an HOA uniform stepped in front of his car and told him flatly that this was private property and he was not welcome. Nathan simply smiled, reached into his jacket, and pulled out the deed. 10 minutes later, panic began spreading through the entire neighborhood, because a secret they had buried for years was about to surface. The days leading up to that letter had been quiet, almost uneventful, the kind of ordinary week that gives no warning of the turn it is about to take. Nathan Cole was 42 years old, a former construction engineer who had spent the better part of 2 decades reading blueprints, inspecting foundations, and solving problems that other people considered impossible. He lived a modest life in a small rented house, 2 states away, the kind of life built on discipline rather than luxury. His uncle, Walter Coleman, had been a quiet man, the sort of relative who sent a card at Christmas and rarely called otherwise. Walter had lived alone for most of his adult life, and nobody in the family really knew the full extent of what he owned or how he had spent his final years. When the attorney handling the estate called Nathan to arrange a meeting, Nathan expected paperwork about a modest house, maybe some savings, nothing more. He drove to the small law office downtown, sat across from a tired-looking attorney named Robert Hale, and listened as the man explained that Walter Coleman had, in fact, owned 1,100 acres of land in a rural county 3 hours away. Nathan sat in stunned silence for a long moment before finally asking the obvious question, which was what exactly was on that land. Robert Hale admitted that the estate records were surprisingly thin, listing only the original agricultural zoning from decades earlier, with no mention of any development, structures, or leases. Everyone in the room assumed the same thing, that it was probably farmland, maybe with an old barn or two, nothing that required urgent attention. Nathan signed the necessary documents, thanked the attorney, and told him he planned to drive out there that weekend just to see it with his own eyes. He packed a bag, filled his truck with gas, and set out early on a Saturday morning, following the directions on the GPS toward a rural county he had never once visited in his life. The drive took just over 3 hours, winding through small towns, past fields, and eventually toward a stretch of road that seemed unusually well-maintained for something leading to empty farmland. When the GPS announced that he had arrived at his destination, Nathan slowed the truck and stared through the windshield in confusion. Instead of open pastures or a weathered old barn, there was a massive stone entrance gate with iron lettering spelling out the name of a residential community. Beyond the gate stretched paved streets lined with manicured lawns, a shimmering man-made lake, a clubhouse with tall windows, tennis courts, and a small park with wooden benches arranged beneath mature trees. For a moment, Nathan assumed he had entered the wrong address, that some algorithm had simply guided him to the wrong coordinates. He pulled over, checked the documents again, cross-referenced the parcel numbers with the GPS coordinates, and confirmed that everything matched exactly. The land in front of him, all of it, the gate, the lake, the clubhouse, the tennis courts, the winding streets full of comfortable homes, belonged legally to him. He sat there for several minutes, simply staring at the community sprawled before him, trying to process how a man as quiet and private as his uncle had ended up owning something this large and this developed. He stepped out of the truck for a moment, standing on the shoulder of the road, and simply looked at the scale of what stretched before him. Rows of two-story homes with matching shutters lined the streets beyond the gate, each one landscaped with the kind of precision that suggested strict community rules rather than individual taste. A groundskeeper's cart rolled slowly along the far side of the lake, trimming hedges that had clearly been shaped that way for years, not months. Nathan thought about his uncle, a man who wore the same flannel jacket to every family gathering for a decade, and tried to imagine him having any connection at all to a place this polished. Nothing about the image fit together in his mind, and that mismatch was exactly what convinced him he needed to walk through that gate, rather than simply drive away confused. He got back into the truck, took a slow breath, and pulled forward toward the entrance, unsure of what he would find, but certain that he needed answers. As he approached the gate, a uniformed security guard stepped forward and raised a hand, signaling him to stop. Nathan rolled down his window and explained calmly that he believed he had just inherited this property and wanted to take a look around. The guard's expression shifted from mild irritation to something closer to alarm, and he immediately radioed someone inside the community. Within minutes, a woman marched briskly toward the gate, wearing a blazer with an embroidered HOA emblem stitched over the pocket, her posture rigid and her expression sharp. She introduced herself as Diane Marsh, president of the Homeowners Association, and asked Nathan exactly what business he had trying to enter a private community uninvited. Nathan explained again, patiently, that he had recently inherited the land the community sat upon, and he simply wanted to understand what he now owned. Diane Marsh laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and told him that this community had existed for years, and that whoever the previous landowner had been, that person had long since forfeited any claim to the property. She said the phrase again for emphasis, forfeited any claim, as though repeating it might make it true through sheer force of tone. Nathan reached for the folder on his passenger seat and handed her a copy of the certified deed through the open window, watching her expression carefully as she skimmed it. Diane barely glanced at the document before handing it back, informing him coolly that anyone with a printer could produce a piece of paper claiming almost anything. She told him that if he did not turn his truck around immediately, she would have no choice but to call the sheriff and have him charged with trespassing. Nathan did not raise his voice or argue further, which seemed to unsettle Diane more than any confrontation would have. He simply nodded, thanked her for her time, and turned his truck back toward the main road, watching the gate shrink in his rearview mirror as he pulled away. He did not go far, though, stopping at a small diner a few miles down the highway to gather his thoughts over a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm before he even touched it. Something about the entire encounter felt wrong to him, not just the hostility, but the confidence behind it, as though Diane Marsh genuinely believed the law was on her side. Before he even finished his coffee, Nathan called Robert Hale and asked him to dig deeper into the property records because something about that gated community did not add up. Robert promised to look into it first thing Monday morning, and Nathan drove the 3 hours home with far more questions than he had arrived with that morning. By Wednesday of that week, Robert Hale called Nathan with news that made the entire situation far stranger than either of them had anticipated. According to county records, the residential community, referred to internally as Coleman Ridge Estates, had been built and expanded over the course of nearly 15 years. Homeowners within the community owned their individual houses, and the small parcels of land directly beneath them purchased fair and square through standard real estate transactions. However, the surrounding land, the roads, the common areas, the lake, the clubhouse grounds, and the tennis courts all sat on the larger 1,100-acre parcel that had never been subdivided or sold. That land had remained under Walter Coleman's name the entire time, quietly accumulating property tax bills that Walter, for reasons no one could yet explain, had continued to pay without ever visiting or developing it himself. Robert explained that somewhere along the way, likely not long after the community's first phase was completed, the Homeowners Association had begun operating as though the surrounding acreage belonged to them collectively. They had built the clubhouse, installed the lake, paved the internal roads, and constructed the tennis courts, all without ever securing a formal easement, lease, or purchase agreement from the actual landowner. For years, the association had been collecting monthly dues from residents, charging fees for use of the amenities, and even leasing portions of the parking areas to a nearby event company for weekend gatherings. Nathan sat quietly on the phone as Robert listed figure after figure, dues collected, event fees charged, maintenance costs billed to residents for infrastructure the association did not actually own. The total revenue collected over the years, based on preliminary estimates, easily reached into the millions of dollars, all generated from land that legally belonged to someone else entirely. Nathan finally understood what had likely happened, piecing the story together the way he once pieced together blueprints on a job site. Walter Coleman had probably purchased the land decades earlier, perhaps intending to develop it himself or simply to hold on to it as an investment, before a developer approached him or simply began building without full authorization. As Walter aged and withdrew further from public life, the association likely assumed that since no one ever challenged their use of the land, no one ever would. They had built an entire community's identity around amenities sitting on borrowed ground, all while believing that an elderly recluse in failing health would never notice or care enough to intervene. Nathan asked Robert directly whether this meant the Homeowners Association had been operating illegally for years, and Robert answered carefully that from what he could see so far, that appeared to be exactly the case. The two men agreed to meet in person the following week to review the full scope of records before deciding on their next move. Robert also raised a question that had been nagging at him since he first opened Walter's file, wondering aloud why a man who paid his property taxes faithfully every single year had never once stepped forward to challenge a community built entirely on his own land. He pulled Walter's tax filings from a full decade earlier and noticed something strange, a handwritten note attached to one of the older payment records, faded but still legible, simply stating that the matter would be addressed when the time was right. Nathan sat with that phrase for a long while after the call ended, turning it over in his mind, wondering whether his uncle had been waiting for something, or perhaps someone, before ever confronting the community himself. It occurred to him that Walter may have known exactly what was happening on that land the entire time, choosing silence, not out of ignorance, but out of some private, unexplained patience that Nathan would now have to finish on his behalf. That thought settled over him with a quiet weight, transforming the entire situation from a simple legal dispute into something closer to unfinished family business. He decided then that whatever came next, he would see it through properly, the way his uncle apparently intended all along. In the days that followed, Nathan drafted a formal letter through Robert's office, requesting a meeting with the Homeowners Association's board to discuss the boundaries of the property and the future of the land beneath the community. The letter was polite, professional, and deliberately non-confrontational, simply asking for cooperation in reviewing survey records and discussing a path forward that would work for everyone involved. He mailed it certified, ensuring there would be a clear record of delivery, and waited for a response that he assumed would come within a reasonable amount of time. Instead of a response, what came back was silence for nearly 2 weeks, followed by an email forwarded to him from a resident who had grown curious about the situation. The Homeowners Association had held an emergency meeting, and during that meeting, Diane Marsh had stood before hundreds of residents and painted Nathan as a greedy outsider attempting to extort money from hardworking families. According to residents who later described the meeting, Diane told the crowd that a man claiming to be a distant relative of the previous landowner was trying to seize control of community property for personal profit. She suggested that his claims were likely fraudulent, that real estate scammers frequently targeted established communities like theirs, and that the board intended to fight back on behalf of every homeowner present. The association sent a mass email to the entire neighborhood mailing list, describing Nathan in vague but alarming terms, warning residents not to speak with him if he approached their homes or contacted them directly. Word spread quickly through the community's private online groups, where residents began sharing increasingly exaggerated versions of the story, some claiming Nathan intended to bulldoze the clubhouse, others insisting he planned to charge residents rent simply to drive on their own streets. Nathan learned about all of this secondhand, through Robert, who had been contacted by a concerned resident asking whether any of it was true. Robert advised Nathan firmly to stay quiet and let the facts speak through official channels, rather than responding publicly to rumors designed to provoke a reaction. A handful of residents, unsettled by the tone of Diane's message, reached out to Nathan directly after finding his contact information through the county's public court filings. One of them, a retired mechanic named Gary Holt, who had lived in the community for nearly 9 years, admitted over the phone that something about the association's panic felt disproportionate for a claim they insisted was fraudulent. Gary explained that he had always found the yearly dues increases strange, given how little visible improvement ever seemed to follow them, and he wondered aloud whether Nathan's arrival might finally explain years of unanswered questions. Nathan thanked him for reaching out but kept the conversation brief, careful not to say anything that could later be twisted into evidence of him pressuring residents. Still, that short phone call stayed with him, a quiet reminder that not everyone inside that gate had been fooled, and that somewhere within the community, doubt was already beginning to take root on its own. Nathan found the entire situation deeply frustrating, but he trusted Robert's judgment and resisted the urge to defend himself directly to the community. Instead, he channeled his energy into something far more productive, hiring an independent land surveying firm to conduct a full boundary review of the entire 1,100-acre parcel. He also brought in a county land inspector to formally document exactly which structures sat where, ensuring that every measurement would hold up under legal scrutiny if the matter ever reached a courtroom. The surveying team spent nearly 2 weeks walking the property, using modern equipment to map every inch of the boundary lines against the original recorded plat from decades earlier. Nathan drove out twice during that period, staying at a small motel outside the county rather than attempting to enter the gated community itself, watching from a respectful distance as the surveyors worked. The lead surveyor, a methodical man named James Foster who had worked county land disputes for over 20 years, told Nathan privately that he had rarely seen a boundary line so cleanly and completely ignored by everything built around it. Foster explained that whoever had planned the community's layout must have either overlooked the original recorded plat entirely or simply chosen not to consult it, an oversight that seemed almost impossible for a development of this size and cost. Nathan asked him whether that kind of mistake happened often, and Foster admitted that it usually did not at this scale, which only deepened Nathan's suspicion that the oversight had been deliberate rather than accidental. He wanted no accusations of interference, no claims that he had pressured anyone or tampered with equipment, understanding that patience and precision would serve him far better than confrontation. When the survey results finally came back, they confirmed exactly what Robert had suspected from the earlier records review, though seeing it laid out in precise measurements still struck Nathan with force. The clubhouse, the entire structure, along with its surrounding patio and parking area, sat squarely within the boundaries of the 1,100-acre parcel. The community lake, artificially constructed and stocked with fish for resident enjoyment, had been dug directly into land that had never left Walter Coleman's ownership. The tennis courts, the internal road network connecting every home in the neighborhood, and even the grand stone entrance gate itself, all stood on land that legally belonged to Nathan. There was no recorded easement granting the association rights to build on that land, no lease agreement, no license, and no documentation of any kind suggesting the previous landowner had ever authorized a single structure. The inspector's final report used blunt, official language, stating simply that the homeowners association had constructed and continued to operate multiple structures on private property without legal authorization of any kind. Robert reviewed the findings with Nathan and told him plainly that this was now far more than a boundary dispute. It was a matter that could reshape the entire community's future. Armed with the surveyor's findings and the inspector's official report, Nathan authorized Robert to send a formal notice to the Homeowners Association's Board of Directors. The letter stated clearly that the association had 30 days to enter good faith negotiations regarding a legal lease or purchase agreement for the land beneath their shared amenities. It further stated that if no agreement could be reached, or if the association refused to engage in discussions entirely, Nathan would pursue all available legal remedies, including the removal of unauthorized structures from his property. The letter was measured, factual, and free of threats, beyond mind, what the law itself allowed, exactly the kind of communication Robert had built his reputation on drafting. When it arrived at the association's office, Diane Marsh reportedly read it aloud during a closed board meeting and laughed, telling the other board members that the man had no idea who he was dealing with. She assured them confidently that 15 years of continuous use had likely established some form of legal claim on the association's behalf, though she offered no citation or legal basis for that belief whatsoever. At the next general community meeting, held in the very clubhouse now under legal scrutiny, Diane stood before a packed room and declared that the association's legal team, which in reality consisted of a single semi-retired attorney who rarely returned calls, would handle the matter swiftly. She told residents not to worry, insisting that people like Nathan filed baseless claims all the time, hoping for quick settlements, and that the board had no intention of giving him a single dollar. Some residents applauded, reassured by her confidence, while others sat quietly, exchanging uneasy glances with their neighbors. A retired schoolteacher named Carol Ashford raised her hand near the back of the room and asked a simple question, wondering aloud whether the board could actually show everyone the documents, proving the association legally owned the land in question. Diane's expression flickered for just a moment before she recovered, telling Carol that such records were confidential and available only to board members for security reasons. That answer did not sit well with several residents, who began quietly discussing amongst themselves after the meeting ended, wondering why something so basic would require such secrecy. Over the next several days, small clusters of neighbors began meeting on porches and in driveways rather than waiting for the association's official channels to provide any clarity. A former accountant named Susan Reyes, who lived 2 streets from the clubhouse, offered to review whatever financial documents the board would provide, having grown suspicious of the association's bookkeeping long before Nathan ever appeared. When her request was met with the same vague refusals Carol had received, Susan began quietly compiling her own records from years of dues, statements, and public meeting minutes she had saved out of habit. She noticed inconsistencies almost immediately, expenses that never matched the amenities they were supposedly funding, and repair costs that seemed to double in price from one year to the next, without explanation. She shared her findings with a small group of trusted neighbors, careful not to alarm the wider community until she had something concrete enough to stand behind. That quiet, careful documentation would later prove far more damaging to the board than anything Nathan himself ever said in public. Over the following days, a small but growing group of residents began asking pointed questions in the community's private online forums and at informal gatherings near the mailboxes. They requested copies of the original land purchase agreements, the deeds establishing common area ownership, anything that would put their minds at ease regarding the legitimacy of the community's amenities. The board repeatedly stalled, offering vague explanations about pending legal reviews, and advising residents to trust the process rather than seek outside information. This response, rather than calming anyone down, only deepened the growing suspicion among homeowners who had lived in the community for years and simply wanted clarity. Meanwhile, Nathan's 30-day deadline continued to approach, with no response from the association beyond Diane's public dismissals and private assurances to her board that everything would resolve itself favorably. When the deadline passed without any formal communication from the association's legal representative, Robert filed a civil lawsuit on Nathan's behalf, seeking a court determination on rightful ownership and use of the disputed land. The lawsuit moved through the county court system more quickly than either Nathan or Robert had anticipated, largely because the underlying facts were so clearly documented. When the first hearing finally arrived, the small county courtroom filled with an unusual mixture of curious residents, local reporters covering what had quickly become the talk of the county, and the tense, formally dressed representatives of both sides. Diane Marsh sat beside the association's aging attorney, her posture stiff, her expression a careful mask of confidence that did not entirely reach her eyes. When given the opportunity to speak, she repeated the same arguments she had offered residents for weeks, insisting that 15 years of continuous, unchallenged use had effectively established the association's right to the land. She claimed the previous owner had known about the development for years and had never once objected, treating his silence as a form of implicit consent that any reasonable court should honor. The judge listened patiently, occasionally jotting notes, before finally asking Diane's attorney to produce any documentation supporting these claims, a request that was met with an uncomfortable pause before he admitted no such formal documentation existed. When it came time for Robert to present Nathan's case, he moved through the evidence methodically, laying out each document like pieces of a puzzle finally being assembled into a complete picture. He presented the original recorded plat map from decades earlier, showing the 1,100-acre parcel exactly as it had always existed, undivided and unsold. He introduced Walter Coleman's property tax records, demonstrating an unbroken chain of ownership and continuous tax payments, stretching back long before the community's first home had ever been built. He submitted Walter's will alongside the certified deed, transferring ownership to Nathan, establishing beyond doubt exactly who held legal title to the land in question. Finally, Robert presented a series of satellite images spanning multiple years, time-stamped and sourced from public archives, clearly showing the gradual construction of the clubhouse, lake, tennis courts, and road network directly atop land that public records confirmed had never changed ownership. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, forming an argument that grew increasingly difficult to dispute with every passing minute. At one point, the judge asked Robert directly whether the satellite imagery could be independently verified, and Robert calmly confirmed that the same images were available through a public federal archive, meaning anyone in the room could pull them up themselves within minutes. That single exchange seemed to land harder than any of the earlier testimony, because it made clear that nothing being presented depended on Nathan's word alone. The association's attorney attempted a brief cross-examination, asking Robert whether the previous landowner had ever filed a formal complaint about the community's construction over the years. Robert answered honestly that no complaint had been filed, but reminded the court that the absence of a complaint from an elderly, private individual was not the same thing as legal permission, a distinction the judge appeared to note carefully. By the time Robert concluded his presentation, the mood inside the courtroom had shifted noticeably, the earlier murmurs of doubt about Nathan's claim replaced by a heavier, more uncertain silence. During a recess in the proceedings, something unexpected began to unfold outside the courtroom doors, as reporters covering the case started digging into the Homeowners Association's financial history out of simple curiosity. What they found, and what soon became part of the ongoing legal discovery process, painted a picture far uglier than a simple boundary dispute. Financial records subpoenaed as part of the lawsuit revealed that the association had collected well over $3 million in dues, event fees, and amenity charges over the preceding decade. Rather than maintaining a properly documented reserve fund as required by standard association bylaws, large portions of that money appeared to have been spent with little oversight or accountability. Diane Marsh's compensation as association president, technically supposed to be a modest stipend for volunteer service, had quietly grown into a substantial salary paid out through a series of vaguely labeled administrative accounts. Records showed payments for personal vehicle leases, several out-of-state trips labeled as association conferences, and expensive dinners charged to accounts meant for community maintenance and repairs. Susan Reyes, the former accountant who had quietly begun compiling her own records weeks earlier, submitted her findings to Robert's office once the lawsuit's discovery process officially opened the association's books to scrutiny. Her independent analysis lined up almost exactly with what the subpoenaed bank statements eventually confirmed, giving Robert a head start in identifying which transactions deserved the closest attention during testimony. When these details became public knowledge, first through courtroom testimony and then through local news coverage, the reaction among residents shifted from uneasy suspicion to outright fury. The following community meeting, originally scheduled to discuss unrelated landscaping decisions, turned instead into a chaotic gathering dominated entirely by residents demanding answers about the financial revelations. Carol Ashford, the same retired teacher who had first questioned the board weeks earlier, stood up and read aloud a list of expenses pulled directly from the subpoenaed records, her voice steady despite the anger clearly building beneath it. Other residents followed, sharing their own frustrations about years of rising dues that never seemed to translate into visible improvements, now finally understanding where at least some of that money had actually gone. Diane attempted to defend herself, claiming the expenses had all been properly approved and that residents simply misunderstood the complexities of running a community this size. Her explanations, however, grew increasingly tangled and inconsistent, and several board members who had stood beside her for years suddenly found themselves unable to offer any defense of their own. Two board members, visibly shaken by the scale of public anger directed at the association, stood up in the middle of the meeting and announced their immediate resignation, stating simply that they had not been aware of the extent of the financial mismanagement. The meeting ended in disarray, but for the first time since Nathan had first driven through that gate, the balance of power within the community had visibly begun to shift. Several weeks later, the court issued its final ruling on the underlying question of land ownership, and the decision left little room for interpretation. The judge ruled unequivocally that Nathan Cole held full and undisputed legal title to the entire 1,100-acre parcel, including every structure, road, and amenity the Homeowners Association had built without authorization. The ruling confirmed that the association possessed no legal easement, lease, or ownership claim to the disputed land, and that 15 years of unauthorized use did not, under the applicable state law, create any binding right to continue that use indefinitely. As the rightful owner, Nathan now legally held the power to demand removal of the unauthorized structures, to charge the association substantial back payment for years of unpermitted use, or even to fence off the land entirely and deny access altogether. Diane Marsh sat motionless as the ruling was read, her earlier confidence completely drained from her expression, replaced by the slow realization of just how badly she had miscalculated. Reporters outside the courthouse captured the moment residents who had gathered to hear the verdict began speaking among themselves. Some relieved that a resolution had finally been reached, others anxious about what might come next for their homes and their community. In the days following the ruling, many observers assumed Nathan would pursue the most aggressive options now legally available to him, perhaps fencing off the amenities entirely, or demanding an enormous financial settlement from the association. Instead, Nathan asked Robert to draft a different kind of proposal, one built not around punishment but around a fair and sustainable path forward for everyone actually living in the community. The proposal required the homeowners association to issue a formal, public apology, acknowledging years of unauthorized use of private land without proper disclosure to residents. It required the association to pay reasonable compensation for that historical use, calculated fairly rather than punitively, and to immediately enter a legitimate, transparent long-term lease agreement for the land beneath the shared amenities going forward. Finally, it required a complete restructuring of the association's leadership, removing anyone who had knowingly participated in or concealed the years of financial mismanagement from their positions of authority. Should the association refuse these terms, Nathan made clear through Robert that he retained every right the court had just confirmed, including closing the gate, shutting down the clubhouse, and reclaiming the amenity land entirely. Faced with that choice, laid plainly beside the alternative, an emergency vote was called among the community's homeowners regarding the association's future leadership. The vote, held over the course of a single tense evening in the very clubhouse whose ownership had sparked this entire conflict, resulted in an overwhelming decision to remove Diane Marsh from her position as president effective immediately. Residents who had once applauded her confident dismissals now stood in near unanimous agreement that new leadership was needed to rebuild trust and move the community forward honestly. Diane left the meeting that night without addressing the crowd, her once commanding presence reduced to a quiet, hurried exit through a side door most residents barely noticed. In her place, the community elected a small interim board composed largely of residents who had spoken up earliest about wanting transparency, including Carol Ashford, who reluctantly agreed to help guide the transition. Within a week, this new board reached out directly to Nathan and Robert, requesting an in-person meeting to begin negotiating the terms of a legitimate agreement for the land their community depended on. Nathan agreed without hesitation, understanding that the goal had never been to punish the ordinary families who called that community home, but simply to correct a wrong that had been allowed to continue for far too long. The meeting between Nathan and the new interim board took place in Robert's small conference room, a stark contrast to the tense courtroom exchanges of just weeks earlier. Carol Ashford spoke first, offering a sincere apology on behalf of the community for how Nathan had been treated from the very first day he arrived at that gate. She acknowledged that many residents, herself included, had allowed themselves to be misled by leadership they trusted without asking the harder questions sooner. Nathan accepted the apology graciously, telling the board plainly that his goal from the beginning had simply been fairness, not revenge against people who had, for the most part, unknowingly benefited from someone else's wrongdoing. Over the following weeks, both sides worked through the details of a long-term lease agreement, setting reasonable annual payments that would fund necessary community maintenance while finally, properly compensating Nathan for the use of his land. During one of their final negotiating sessions, Carol asked Nathan why he had never once, throughout the entire ordeal, tried to use the situation to take more than what seemed fair. Nathan thought about the question for a moment before answering that he had spent years working construction sites where a single miscalculated measurement could cause a building to fail years down the line, and he had learned that fairness built things that lasted, while greed only built things that eventually collapsed. Carol nodded slowly at that, telling him it was the kind of answer she wished Diane had understood a long time before any of this ever became necessary. The agreement also established clear, transparent financial reporting requirements for the association going forward, ensuring that no future leadership could quietly divert funds the way Diane Marsh once had. When the final documents were signed, no homeowner lost their home, no family was displaced, and the clubhouse, lake, and tennis courts remained exactly where they had always been, now simply operating under a legitimate agreement rather than a hidden deception. In the months that followed, Diane Marsh found herself facing consequences that extended well beyond losing her position within the community. The financial irregularities uncovered during the lawsuit prompted a separate investigation by county officials, examining whether her handling of association funds had crossed from mismanagement into outright fraud. Several residents who had lost confidence in her leadership pursued their own civil claims, seeking to recover a portion of the dues they felt had been misused during her years in charge. Her name, once spoken with a kind of wary respect throughout the community, became instead a quiet cautionary tale, mentioned occasionally at gatherings as a reminder of what unchecked authority could allow to happen. Susan Reyes, whose quiet record-keeping had done more to expose the truth than any single courtroom argument, was later asked by the interim board to help design a permanent financial oversight committee for the community going forward. She agreed, insisting only that every report the committee produced be made freely available to any resident who asked, a small condition that spoke volumes about what the community had learned. Carol Ashford remained on the board for just over a year before stepping back into a quieter role, satisfied that the system she had helped put in place no longer depended on any one person's vigilance to function properly. Gary Holt, the retired mechanic who had first called Nathan with his doubts, often joked afterward that he never expected a phone call to a stranger would end up saving his neighborhood, though no one who lived through those months found the comment particularly funny. The community itself changed in smaller, quieter ways too, with residents attending meetings more regularly and asking harder questions than they ever had before Nathan's arrival forced them to. What had once been a place defined by unquestioned trust in its leadership slowly became a place defined instead by shared responsibility, which, as several longtime residents agreed, was a far sturdier foundation to build a neighborhood upon. Nathan, for his part, largely stepped back from the community's daily affairs once the lease agreement was finalized, visiting occasionally to walk the property and check on the land. Standing near the entrance gate one quiet afternoon, watching children ride bicycles down streets that had once been the center of so much conflict, Nathan finally understood something about his uncle's long silence. A man who perhaps simply never found the right moment to reveal what he truly owned. Nathan eventually climbed a small rise overlooking the entire community, the same hill his uncle had likely stood upon decades earlier before any of this had been built. From there, he could see the full 1,100 acres spread before him, the lake catching the afternoon light, the clubhouse roofline visible above the trees, the neat rows of homes belonging to families who now lived there honestly, without the shadow of a hidden deception hanging over their community. He had not fought this battle for money, and in the end, the financial terms of the settlement had been modest compared to what he legally could have demanded from an association that had wronged him from the very first moment they met. What mattered to him instead was something far simpler, a principle he had believed in long before he ever inherited a single acre of land. No one, regardless of how much power, confidence, or institutional authority they claimed to hold, had the right to take what belonged to someone else and simply call it their own. As the sun began to set over Coleman Ridge Estates, casting long shadows across land that had finally found its rightful honest order, Nathan turned and walked back down the hill, satisfied not by triumph, but by the quiet, lasting weight of justice finally done right.